morning. If you have your Bible today or a way to access your Bible, we're going to be in the Old Testament book of Numbers. Any of you who like math, this is your favorite book in the Bible. We're going to read a little bit of Numbers chapter 13 and 14. We're going to look at one of the most important moments in the entire Bible. A moment when the nation of Israel would have come to face with some of their fears. We're in this series we're calling Fear Less, and we're looking at what does the Bible have to say to us about how we can fear less. Fear is part of our life, isn't it? I mean, some of us were probably afraid of something before we got here. You might be sitting there right now afraid of something if you really maybe thought about it. When I think of fear, like real panic, I think of September 30th, 2014. Not too long ago, just a few years ago. You'll remember the story. When a man flew in from the country of Liberia into Dallas, September the 30th, and he went to see some friends, and he got sick. He went to get medical help, and before long, he was in the hospital in Dallas. He was at the Presbyterian Hospital, and his condition got worse and worse and worse until a week later, he died, October the 8th. The man's name was Thomas Eric Duncan, and he had a dangerous disease called Ebola. How many of you remember that story, the Ebola epidemic of 2014? It's an incredible moment because the whole nation was fixated. You turned to any television station, it was all about what was happening in Dallas, about the two nurses that were caring for the guy, how they had contracted the disease. People everywhere were wondering if they were going to get it. The politicians were talking about shutting down all the airports and international travel. Everywhere you went, any medical place, medical personnel were told, ask people, have you been to Africa? Because that's where much of the disease was coming from. And so everywhere we went, there was this sense of fear and panic. And some people were telling me, I don't even want to get out of the house. I'm afraid I might get the disease. Now we look back on that in 2014, and we kind of have a little bit of hindsight, right? You go back and you think, I wonder how many people got Ebola in America. And you go back and you look at the statistics or the facts that came out of it, and 2 people contracted the disease. Did you know that in the United States? You may not have known that if you'd have watched the news. I mean, only 2 people, the 2 nurses caring for the man. In fact, in the history of our country, did you know that only 2 people have ever died? Neither of them were from the United States. Both of them came from another country here, and one of them was this man in Dallas. Since then, no one has gotten in fact, how many of you in this room, just raise your hand, how many of you have had Ebola? Nobody. Here, the entire nation, the entire world was fixated on what in all reality was nothing ultimately for us but a fear. In a sense, a figment of our own imaginations, a worry about what was the worst case scenario for all of us. This is exactly the same thing that we're going to read about here in the story of the Bible. In the story of God's people, Israel, who God had just guided out of Egyptian slavery. He'd just taken them out of Africa. Moses had seen God at a burning bush, and God said, go down and tell Pharaoh, let my people go. And Moses leads Israel out of Egypt. He leads them through the Red Sea, dry ground. Pharaoh's armies are killed. He guides them to the Mount Sinai, where they come face to face with the living God. When they don't have food, he sends food from the sky. Pretty good deal. When they don't have water, he sends it from the rocks. God has been guiding them with a pillar of fire at night and a cloud by day. The hand of God has been leading us, and they get all the way to the edge of the promised land. They are encamped in a desert oasis in the southern Negev of Israel. If you and I were to get in an airplane this afternoon, we were going to fly to Tel Aviv. It's a long flight, just went there, I'll tell you all about it. And you were to get in a car and you were to drive all the way to the southern end of Israel today, at the end of the Negev desert, just before you get to Egypt, just before you cross the border. There's a little village there called Kadesh Barnea. And Israel was encamped there. It's a desert oasis. In the middle of the desert, there's a place that archaeologists have found, an oasis that pumps out 10,500 gallons of water a day. And when you don't have any water, that's a lot of water. And they were camped there. And Moses said to all the different nations, the different tribes of Israel, there were 12 of them, remember? He'd say, okay, I want one from each of you. Send one person, 12 people as spies who are going to go into the Holy Land, the promised land, and they're going to see what they can see and come back with a report. And they came back with a report. 40 days they were in the wilderness. 40 days they were in the land. They came back with a report. Not just a report that you could talk about, but a report you could taste. They brought back grapes. Grapes so many that they had to carry them on clusters on a pole between two men. Pomegranates and figs. That may be not your favorite fruit, but in Israel, when you live in a desert, that's pretty good stuff. There were pasture lands where the sheep and the goats grazed, and such that there was plenty of milk to drink. It was agricultural paradise where the bees were buzzing, so there was plenty of honey. It was a land truly flowing with milk and honey. See how I did that? They came back with an incredible report. But they also reported something else, that there were some people in the land, that there were some nations, Hittites and Amalekites, and there was even some people that were pretty strong and powerful. And there was a mixed feeling about whether or not the nation should continue to go forward. In fact, the majority of the people said, we shouldn't do it. We should turn around and go home. I want to read to you this moment in the Numbers chapter 14, verse 26. They came back to Moses. They got the report in hand. They got some pomegranates for you to eat. Some grapes. You want some? You getting hungry? They came back to Moses and Aaron and the whole Israelite community at Kadesh in the desert of Paran. And they reported to them and to the whole assembly, and they showed them the fruit of the land. They're like, here it is, take a look. These guys hadn't seen that kind of food in a while. They gave Moses this account. We went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. That's a metaphor, by the way, if you don't know that. It doesn't mean like there's literally rivers of milk and honey. It's a metaphor. Here is its fruit, but the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified, and they're very large. We even saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites live in the Negev, that's in the desert. The Hittites and Jebusites and Amorites live in the hill country. And the Canaanites live near the sea and along the Jordan. Then Caleb, you'll remember Caleb. He silenced the people. Shh! Now stop talking and listen. Shh! He said, we should go up. We should take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it. Verse 31, but the men who had gone with him said, we can't attack those people. They're stronger than we are. They're spread among the Israelites, and they spread among the Israelites a bad report. Can you almost hear them running around going, we don't want to go. Tell everybody we don't want to go. About the land that they had explored, and they said, the land we explored devours those living in it. Now, wait a minute. Like what? Like we go there and the land like eats us or something? All the people we saw there were of great size. Wait a minute, that's not true. All of them were of great size? I mean, they're huge. All of them are big. Like they're born 10 feet tall or something. We saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak that came from the Nephilim. This is kind of like saying, we saw the boogeyman there. And we seem like grasshoppers in our own eyes. And we look the same to them. Like, how do they know what they look like to them? Like, are they inside their heads? Grasshoppers is the smallest creature that an Israelite could eat. In other words, they're saying that we look like little bugs that they could smush. That night, all the members of the community raised their voices. Can you hear them? They wept aloud. The Israelites grumbled. Can you hear them? Against Moses and Aaron, and the whole Israelite assembly said to them, if only we had died in Egypt or in this wilderness. Why is the Lord, and notice who they're blaming here is God. Why is the Lord bringing us to this land? Only to let us fall by the sword. Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better to go back to Egypt? Can you just hear them just freaking out? And they said to each other, we should choose a leader and go back to Egypt. Then Moses and Aaron fell face down in front of the whole Israelite assembly gathered there. And Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb the son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had explored the land, and they tore their clothes. It's a symbol of repentance before God. Tore their clothes, and they said to the entire Israelite assembly, The land we passed through and explored is exceedingly good. And if the Lord is pleased with us, He will lead us into the land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and will give it to us. Only do not rebel against the Lord. And do not be, what's the word? Afraid. And do not be afraid of the people of the land, because we will devour them. Their protection is gone. The Lord is with us. Do not be afraid. This is a moment where the nation of Israel will have to face their giants. But these are not giants like David and Goliath. These are the giants of their own imagination. Their fears. Their fears. It will be their fears that they will have to face in this moment. And this morning, I want you, if you would, just real quickly, to notice what fear does. This is an incredible moment to see what fear does in your life and what fear does in my life. We all have fears, so if we're going to deal with fears, we have to figure out how fear works. And I don't care if you're a 5-year-old kid today or you're 105 years old, you have fear in your life. And we all need to stop for a moment and kind of go, okay, now how does fear work on me? Like, what does fear do? And how do I get a handle on it? Well, here's the first thing fear does. It gets your attention. It focuses you on an obstacle, right? Anybody scared of spiders? Okay. You're just going through a normal morning, and you go in the bathroom, and there's a spider. You know? You're getting breakfast together. You're hungry. You really want to eat. There's a spider. Oh, no. I got to get out of the kitchen. Right? It grabs your attention. The other day on television, there was an NBA game. San Antonio Spurs were playing somebody, and they stopped the game in the middle of the game because there were bats flying around in there. I mean, can you imagine? You stopped it because of bats. What fear does is it grabs your attention. It demands it. It seizes it. I mean, the most important thing in the world couldn't be going on, but there's a snake, right? Our fear, it just grips us. It grabs us. It seizes us. And this is what happens in this moment. The Israelites are on their way to the promised land. Everything's going great. And then they're like, wait a minute. There's some big cities over there. And those people over there, they look kind of tough. I'm not sure we can do this. And they begin to focus on the obstacle. But then what happens when you focus on something? You know this. If you focus on something long enough or hard enough, like a magnifying glass, it starts to get bigger, doesn't it? Fear not only focuses your attention, it magnifies the size of the challenge. It magnifies what you're dealing with. In fact, they're going to come back and their fears are going to start to take hold, and they're going to start telling people things that aren't true because of their fear. Numbers 13:32 says, and they spread among the Israelites a bad report. This is what they said. The land we explored devours those living in it. I mean, that's not true, is it? This is a land flowing with milk and honey. It doesn't devour anybody. But that's what they say because of their fear. All the people we saw there of great size. I mean, it's like it was just a few people, and now it's everybody was huge. And we saw the Nephilim there. You can see what's happening. The fear is magnifying the size to the point where they say we're just like grasshoppers in there. When you focus on your fear, fear gets bigger, doesn't it? It gets larger. The difficult becomes impossible. The hard wall to break through becomes the impenetrable. The army that you're facing, the enemy that you're facing that was difficult becomes unconquerable. It's like when you're riding in the car and you know that little mirror on the side of your car and it has those words on it. What does it say? Do you ever read that? You're not supposed to while you're driving, but objects in the mirror may... Yeah, so the mirror actually can make the objects seem larger, bigger. They can actually make the problem seem bigger than what the problem actually is. And if you're not careful, it just continues to go and it continues to grow. I was in China a few years ago. I got to go on a trip to go over there. And it turns out when you go to China, you're not necessarily supposed to go over there and tell everybody about Jesus, that it's not a free country. And I was a little worried about that, but not enough to not go. And when I got there, I was doing just fine when the missionaries were walking me through the streets, and they said, David, we're so glad you're here, and you have a lot of courage to be here because you know what you're doing is against the law. And as they're saying that to me, we're walking in front of the communist headquarters with army tanks and soldiers out front, and I'd gulp a few times. I'm like, Well, actually, technically, I didn't know it was fully illegal what I was doing here. But that night in the hotel room, every sound I heard, someone walking down the hallway, I think to myself, I could be a police officer coming to get me. Every sound, it could be a soldier coming to, and pretty soon I found myself not just being like a little bit afraid of something, but I began to feel like everything was out to get me, right? My little fear began to grow and to multiply and to magnify. And I just remember that moment of how I had to actually tell myself in that moment that that's just the fear. And that the worst thing that could probably possibly happen to me is not really as bad as I would imagine it being. But what happens when fear goes full force in our life is it doesn't just get our attention or it doesn't just magnify the problem. It's what we saw with the Ebola crisis. It produces a panic. Somebody said fear spreads like a virus. The stories began to go out. By nightfall, the people were all freaking out. It was like yelling fire in a crowded theater. If you'd have walked around as a news reporter back in those days in the Kadesh Barnea News, and you were to walk up to some of the Israelites and say, how do you feel about our fearless leader Moses? What are Moses' favorabilities? They would have put the favorability chart on the evening news, and 99.998% unfavorables. Nobody liked Moses in that moment, did they? We need a new leader, one that'll get us out of this trouble and take away all of our fears. Numbers 14:1 tells us what happens. That night, all the members of the community raised their voices and wept aloud. All the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The whole assembly said, if only we had died in Egypt or in the wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us to this land only so that we could fall by the sword? Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better to go back to Egypt? And they said to each other, we should choose a leader and go back to Egypt. This moment, if you don't know this or not, you know how the Bible it says that Israel wandered in the wilderness for 40 years? This is why. If you ever wondered why they wandered, why did they wander for 40 years? It is this moment that the entire generation that had witnessed the mighty hand of God open the Red Sea would never enter the promised land because of their fear and their open rebellion against God in this moment. Their fears had canceled the opportunity for them to enter into the promise and the hope that God had prepared for them. Now we see what really happens, though, in this moment is more than just a panic breaking out. These people were called the children of Israel and the children of God. These were supposed to be God's people, God's community. And now in this moment, these people that God had delivered, these people that God had rescued, these people that God had saved, had forgotten about their God. And this is what fear ultimately will do for us. It'll make us forget God. You know, in a moment of absolute panic and fear, one of the last things in the world we think about is God. Now we might say, oh, God, help me. Listen to what happens here in Numbers 14:5. Then Moses and Aaron fell face down in front of the whole Israelite assembly gathered there. Joshua, son of Nun, that's N-U-N. He was not an N-O-N-E, and nor was he the other kind of nun. And Caleb, son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had explored the land, tore their clothes, and they said to the entire Israelite assembly, the land we passed through and explored is exceedingly good. That's the truth. If the Lord is pleased with us, he'll lead us into the land, flowing with milk and honey. He'll give it to us. Underline these words, only do not rebel against the Lord and do not be afraid. And then again he says, do not be afraid. Do you realize that in this moment, for the nation of Israel, the real enemy was not the fortified cities in the promised land. The real enemy was not the sons of Anak or Nephilim. That the real enemy for the people of God was not the people of the land, but it was the fear of their own minds. Their real enemy, the giant, was of their own imagination. That's who they were really battling with in this moment. The challenge for God was never getting Israel out of Egypt. God could have done that easy. His real goal was always to get the Egypt out of the Israelite. It's a whole lot harder to do. But God's answer to them was, you can do it because I am with you. You can do it because I'm your God and I'm with you. This is what fear does. Now, you may be saying, okay, that's what fear does, and I understand a little bit more about fear, but what can I do about it in my life? And I just want us to kind of imagine going back to that moment and saying, what if somebody in that moment could have gotten their attention and changed the course of history? What would it have taken to stop fear from ruining it for an entire generation? Because you know what, we face that in our generation today. How do you defeat it? How do you face your fears? How do you face this giant? Well, just quickly, 3 things here. Number 1, if the people of God in this moment had simply gotten all the facts, get all the facts you can, right? The report had gone out that day, a report that had said all kinds of things about the land and the people living in the land, and the report was exaggerated. It wasn't factual. It wasn't a true report. So start by getting the report. Chapter 13, verse 32 says they spread a bad report. You know, God had actually told them before they entered the land in Exodus chapter 23. So he gives them the law in Exodus 20. In chapter 23, he tells them this: do not spread false reports. I mean, he gives them an instruction before they're even going to face it. Don't do this, and then they go ahead and do it anyway. The story started out with, well, they're powerful, and then it became, they're giants. The walls are hard, and then they became impenetrable. These are rumors. You ever seen a rumor? It's a lie, isn't it? It's circulated about someone or something. Somebody once said a lie gets halfway around the world before the truth gets a chance to put its pants on. It's true, isn't it? You got some bad news, it spreads really fast, doesn't it? A comedian once said, I like rumors. I find out so much about myself I didn't even know. Jimmy Kimmel said, I have a strict policy. I will not and do not publicize unsubstantiated rumors about anyone unless they're very funny. Get the facts, right? The other thing I think in this moment, that if the Israelites would have just stopped and said, you know what, we want to get the facts, we want to get the full report, we want to get all the information, not just from 10 of them, but from all 12 of them. They could have stopped it dead in the tracks. But here's another thing. Check the source. You see, if they would have checked the source, they would have discovered that the 10 who were spreading the rumors had an agenda, right? They wanted everyone to agree with them and go along with them and not go into the land. They had their own agenda. The Bible tells Christians that we should have this thing called discernment. The book of Proverbs puts it like this. Proverbs 14:15. The simple believe anything. That's pretty blunt, isn't it? The simple believe anything. Well, they said it on TV, so it must be true. It was on the internet. It must be a fact. But the prudent give thought to their steps. Now, in the New Testament, the concern is not just being wise about what we hear. The concern in the New Testament is that when we get that information, that we don't then share the wrong information. Listen to what James says, James 1:26. Those who consider themselves religious, do you consider yourself religious? Yet do not keep a tight rein on their tongues, deceive themselves. You could say they fool themselves, and their religion is worthless. You consider yourself religious. Okay, I consider myself religious, I guess. Do you keep a tight rein on your tongue? I mean, I'm religious. I come to church today. I'm worshiping the living God. I'm singing songs. I'm studying the Bible. But do you keep a rein on your tongue? Because what he's sort of saying here, I think, is that we're worshiping God over here, but then with our mouth, we're actually invalidating the very God that we claim that we're worshiping with our tongues. And listen to what Proverbs warns against in Proverbs 11:9. With their mouths, the godless destroy their neighbors. Isn't that interesting? Not with a sword, but with the mouth. But through knowledge, the righteous escape. If Israel had just stopped for a moment and said, let's get the real story, let's find out what's really going on, they might not have rebelled against God. I can remember a few years ago, I was serving at a church in East Texas. It's a big church, and in the summertime, the students all go to student camp in Florida for student camp, and so you can imagine that there's a lot of kids that want to go to the beach in Pensacola. And so we had like 200 students and buses, and we're all going down to Pensacola. And that was such a hard job that summer to be a youth intern and have to spend so much time at the beach in Florida. Let me just tell you, that was hard. Somebody has to do it, right? We're going down, we're heading to Florida, and you're in the bus, and I'm at the back of the bus, and there's all students. And their story starts in the front of the bus, and it starts to work its way through. Have you ever seen a rumor like actually moving through a room? Just the story started at the front, came to the back. And I'd heard this rumor before. It was about somebody at the church or whatever. I knew it wasn't true. I'd checked it all out. I'd heard it lots of times. But by the time it got to the two girls in front of me, I could hear them sharing it with each other, and they'd added details to it that I hadn't even heard before. You know, they were more made up stuff. And they were convinced that it was true, and I kind of leaned over in front of them. I said, girls, that is just a rumor. That is absolutely not true. And one of the girls said, I know it's true because my dad told me it. And I'm like, well, that still doesn't make it true. You know, this still doesn't make it true. It's not true. If somebody would have just stopped, there's 10 who we don't even remember their names, right? We only remember Joshua. So stop. So wait a minute. I'm going to reserve my judgment on this until I hear the full story, till the whole group is gathered, until I hear every bit of it, so I can know all the facts and I can analyze and check the sources. It could have changed the history of this. But the other thing, I mean, the big thing, the elephant in the middle of the room in this story, third thing, change the focus. From the moment this story begins to be told, the focus is always on their fears. It's always on the dangers and the giants and the things they're afraid of, not on the greatness of their God. In this moment, they had forgotten about God. They had forgotten about the God that had led them, the God that had fed them, the God that had guided them, the God that had been with them, the God that had taken them from where they were and was taking them to where He said. They had forgotten about that God, and all they could think about was what they were afraid of. Change your focus. You know that of all the people that were there that moment, the thousands and thousands and thousands who would have come out of Egypt, do you know that only 2 people ever went in to the promised land? Not even Moses got to go in. Joshua and Caleb. Joshua would actually be the man God would appoint to lead the nation into the promised land. And this is God's instruction to him in Joshua 1:6. Be strong and courageous. Facing some fears today? God's saying to us this morning, be strong and courageous because you will lead these people, He tells Joshua, to inherit the land I swore to their ancestors to give them. And then He repeats it in the verse 9 of Joshua 1, and this time He says, and do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. I am with you. I am with you. In our house, we used to sing the song because we watched a lot of VeggieTales. Anybody remember VeggieTales? Remember the song, God is bigger than the... Yeah. Man, we'd sing that song when our kids that sleep at night try to get them to go to bed, stay in your room. God's bigger than the boogeyman. That's true. Because the boogeyman isn't real, is he? He's imaginary. He's our imagination. He's our fear. God is way bigger than anything that's imaginary. God is bigger than anything. God is bigger than the boogeyman. Face the ultimate giant of your mind. 1,600 years ago, the pastor of the largest church in the world, John Chrysostom, the golden-tongued preacher, lived in the capital city of the Roman Empire, Constantinople. Today it's called Istanbul. It's where the emperor of Rome lived. John was the preacher in the capital city. Can you imagine how political his sermons would have been perceived? He was a religious man. He was literally one of the greatest preachers probably in 1,000 years. He had memorized almost the entire Bible when he had lived as a hermit. And when he preached with a fervency of God, and he preached no matter what the consequences were, and the Roman government didn't like it very much, and he found himself living in exile, which is not where you want to live. They let him come back, and they let him preach again, and they thought they had taught him a lesson, But John Chrysostom got up and he preached again God's word. So people came to him, and they said, John, have you lost your mind? Don't you know what the Romans can do to you? And the golden-tongued preacher made a comment that is forever recorded in the annals of history. He said, tell me, what is it we fear? Tell me, what is it we fear? Death? To me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. Exile. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. The confiscation of goods. We brought nothing into the world, and it is certain we can carry nothing out of it. And then he added this line: I fear not poverty. I desire not wealth. I dread not death. John Chrysostom had learned to fear less. What about you? Let's pray.